Behind the mask of normalcy lurked one of history's most disturbing serial killers, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. But what psychological forces created this monster who could seem so ordinary by day? What would Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, see in the fractured psyche of Dahmer? A shadow self completely unleashed, a failed individuation, or something far more complex, a dark mirror reflecting truths about our collective unconscious that we'd rather not face? Tonight, we delve into the abyss where psychology meets monstrosity, where archetype meets aberration, and where the line between human and monster becomes disturbingly blurred. Before we journey into the depths of Dahmer's divided psyche through a Jungian lens, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video, because the revelations ahead might fundamentally change how you understand not just this infamous killer, but the darker potentials that Jung believed exist within our collective unconscious. Drop a comment with your thoughts as we proceed. I'd love to hear your perspective. In the quiet Milwaukee apartment at 924 North 25th Street, evil had found its home. When police finally entered Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment in July 1991, what they discovered defied comprehension: photographs of dismembered bodies, human remains in the refrigerator, and a collection of skulls, the physical evidence of 17 lives brutally extinguished. But what creates such darkness in a human soul? What psychological mechanisms allow someone to compartmentalize their humanity so completely? Carl Jung might tell us that to understand Dahmer, we must first understand his concept of the psyche's divided nature. For Jung, every human mind contains not just consciousness, but a vast personal unconscious, and beyond that, a connection to what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological substrate of humanity, containing primordial images he called archetypes. The most relevant Jungian concept for understanding Dahmer begins with what Jung called the shadow. This is the repository of all we deny in ourselves, all we repress and refuse to acknowledge. It contains our primitive instincts, our unacknowledged desires, our capacity for evil. For most people, the shadow remains largely unconscious, occasionally erupting in moments of rage or in dreams. But in Dahmer's case, something catastrophic happened. His shadow didn't just emerge occasionally. It dominated completely in certain contexts. The shadow, Jung wrote, is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. But what happens when that challenge overwhelms the ego entirely? When the shadow isn't integrated, but instead creates a split so profound that two selves emerge? Dahmer's life history reveals the early formation of this split. As a child, he became fascinated with animal bones after his father showed him how to clean and preserve animal remains found under their home. This innocent scientific demonstration somehow twisted in young Dahmer's psyche. By adolescence, he was collecting roadkill, dissecting animals, and storing their bones. The shadow was already forming its own interests, its own desires. Jung would likely see Dahmer's alcoholism beginning in his teen years as an attempt to quiet the ego's horror at what the shadow desired. Each drink blurred the boundary between his conscious self, the shy, awkward young man who could hold jobs and appear normal to neighbors, and the shadow self with its desires for complete dominion over others. What makes Dahmer particularly fascinating from a Jungian perspective is his keen awareness of his divided nature. Unlike many killers who construct elaborate justifications, Dahmer recognized the horror of his actions. "I know my time is short," he once said. "I know I'm going to hell." This awareness suggests his ego hadn't fully surrendered to the shadow. Instead, they existed in parallel, creating the terrifying duality where he could commit atrocities at night and go to work at a chocolate factory the next morning. Jung's concept of the persona, the social mask we wear, is particularly relevant here. Dahmer maintained an extraordinarily effective persona, described by neighbors as quiet, polite, and unremarkable. This wasn't merely deception in Jungian terms. His persona operated as a semi-autonomous complex, allowing him to function in society while compartmentalizing his shadow activities. Asterisk: the failure of Dahmer's individuation process, Jung's term for the integration of unconscious contents into consciousness toward wholeness, is apparent in his crime's symbolic content. Dahmer didn't just kill. He attempted to create zombies by drilling holes in his victims' heads and injecting chemicals. Jung would likely see this as a perverse attempt at connection. Dahmer wanted companions who couldn't leave him, who would be forever part of him. From a Jungian perspective, Dahmer's cannibalism represents a dark distortion of communion and attempt to incorporate others physically when he could not connect emotionally. Jung believed that when archetypal energies cannot find conscious expression, they manifest in distorted, often destructive ways. The archetypal need for communion and connection became twisted into consumption and possession. Jung would likely see the roots of Dahmer's pathology in his early childhood, his mother's prescription drug use during pregnancy, the reported tensions in his parents' marriage, and his perceived emotional abandonment all contributed to what Jung would call a wounded relationship with the mother archetype. In Jungian psychology, the mother represents not just our biological mother, but our relationship with nurturing, safety, and belonging in the world. When these primary attachments are damaged, the developing psyche may fail to integrate the self properly. Jung wrote extensively about how childhood wounds can create splits in the psyche that later manifest as neurosis or, in extreme cases like Dahmer's, something far more malignant. But Jung would caution us against seeing Dahmer as simply other. The most disturbing implication of Jung's psychology is that the shadow exists in all of us. The difference is not its presence, but its integration and conscious relationship with the ego. What would Jung make of Dahmer's extreme isolation? This killer who longed for connection so desperately that he tried to create living zombies. Jung believed that psychic energy cannot be destroyed, only redirected. When Dahmer's natural human need for intimacy found no healthy outlet, it became inverted and destructive. His inability to form relationships manifested as a desire to possess others completely, not as autonomous beings, but as objects he could control forever. The concept of projection is particularly relevant in understanding Dahmer's psychology. Jung defined projection as the unconscious transfer of one's own unacknowledged psychological elements onto another person. Dahmer projected his fears of abandonment and his own fragility onto his victims, then attempted to ensure they could never leave by destroying their autonomy, first through murder and then through dismemberment and consumption. Perhaps most chilling is how Dahmer's case illustrates Jung's warning about the danger of unconscious psychological content. Until you make the unconscious conscious, Jung wrote, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Dahmer's unconscious drove him toward increasingly horrific acts, while his conscious mind observed with a mixture of horror and fascination. In police interviews, he described watching himself as if from a distance during the killings, a classic description of dissociation that Jung would recognize as evidence of a profound psychic split. Dahmer's collection of body parts and creation of a makeshift altar in his apartment speaks to Jung's understanding of primitive religious impulses. When the psyche cannot find meaning through healthy spiritual channels, these archetypal religious energies can emerge in distorted forms. Dahmer's shrine represented a perverse attempt at creating sacred space. The human need for ritual and transcendence corrupted into something monstrous. Jung's concept of synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence, might help us understand the uncanny aspects of Dahmer's case, such as how he repeatedly escaped capture. In one infamous incident, officers returned a drugged, injured young victim to Dahmer despite the protests of witnesses. Jung might interpret this not as mere coincidence, but as an expression of collective shadow material in the society itself. Racial bias, homophobia, and institutional failures aligning with Dahmer's individual pathology in a disturbing, synchronistic pattern. The collective unconscious that Jung described contains not just positive archetypes like the hero or the wise old man, but also destructive patterns, what we might call the predator or the destroyer. Dahmer embodied these dark archetypal energies so completely that he seems almost mythological in his monstrosity, like ancient tales of wendigos or vampires. His cannibalism and his predation tap into primal human fears that Jung would argue exist in our collective unconscious. What makes the Jungian perspective particularly valuable in understanding Dahmer is its refusal to reduce him to simple categories. Jung's psychology embraces paradox and complexity. Dahmer was not simply evil incarnate. He was human, containing the same fundamental psychological structures as anyone else, but with catastrophic developmental failures and traumas that left those structures horrifically malformed. In Jung's framework, the goal of psychological development is individuation, the process of integrating unconscious contents into consciousness to become a whole, differentiated self. Dahmer's development represents a profound failure of this process. Instead of integration, he experienced fragmentation. Instead of wholeness, he embodied division. The parts of his psyche didn't communicate, they alternated control. The symbolism in Dahmer's methods reveals disturbing psychological patterns. His practice of keeping trophies demonstrates what Jung would see as a primitive magical thinking, the belief that possessing parts of others could somehow allow him to incorporate their essence. Jung observed similar patterns in ancient cultures, where consuming the heart of a brave enemy was thought to transfer courage. Dahmer's modern manifestation of this primitive impulse shows how archetypal patterns can resurface in distorted forms when conscious integration fails. Perhaps most unsettling is Dahmer's own insight into his condition. He once said, "I don't know why I did what I did. I don't know what makes me the way I am." This statement echoes Jung's recognition that we are not fully transparent to ourselves, that powerful forces in the unconscious can drive behavior in ways our conscious mind struggles to comprehend. Jung might interpret Dahmer's lifelong sense of emptiness and his statement that he felt completely numb inside as evidence of what he called the loss of soul, a profound disconnection from the self, Jung's term for the organizing center of the total personality. Without this connection, Dahmer was adrift, seeking external sources to fill an internal void. The progression of Dahmer's crimes becoming increasingly ritualistic and bizarre demonstrates what Jung called inflation, where unconscious archetypal energies overwhelmed the ego. As Dahmer's conscious personality became increasingly dominated by unconscious forces, his behavior grew more extreme. The drilling of holes in victims' heads can be seen as a concrete manifestation of his desire to enter and control their minds, a physical expression of a psychological impulse toward complete dominion. Jung's concept of the anima, the feminine aspect in the male psyche, also offers insight into Dahmer's pathology. A healthy relationship with the anima allows for emotional connection and relatedness. Dahmer's relationship with his anima appears severely damaged, perhaps related to his troubled relationship with his mother. Unable to integrate his anima properly, his capacity for genuine emotional connection was compromised, leaving only the possibility of physical possession as a substitute for intimacy. The disturbing rituals and patterns in Dahmer's crimes reveal what Jung would call active imagination gone horribly wrong. Jung described active imagination as a method for engaging with unconscious content through fantasy, artwork, or ritual. But when these processes occur without conscious guidance or ethical boundaries, they can manifest as compulsive, destructive behaviors. Dahmer's photographing of victims at various stages of dismemberment suggests a perverse form of active imagination or ritual engagement with death and transformation that spoke to deeply archetypal themes but divorced from moral consciousness. Jung's concept of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites, helps explain the shocking contrast between Dahmer's outward persona and his inner reality. The more rigidly Dahmer maintained his mask of normalcy, the more extreme his shadow behaviors became. This psychological principle suggests that the greater the split between conscious and unconscious elements, the more violently the repressed content will eventually emerge. Dahmer's sexual paraphilias, particularly his necrophilia, represent what Jung would call a failure to channel libidinal energy in healthy directions. For Jung, libido was not merely sexual energy, but life force itself. When this energy cannot find conscious, creative expression, it regresses to more primitive forms. Dahmer's attraction to non-responsive partners reveals his fear of genuine exchange. He could only relate to what he could completely control. The tragic irony of Dahmer's case, viewed through a Jungian lens, is that his desperate attempts to forestall abandonment by possessing his victims completely ultimately reinforced his isolation. Jung understood that genuine connection requires acknowledging the autonomy and separateness of the other. By trying to incorporate others physically rather than relating to them as separate beings, Dahmer entrapped himself in an ever-deepening spiritual isolation. The developmental trajectory of Dahmer's pathology follows what Jung might call a negative individuation path. Rather than integrating shadow material into consciousness in a way that enriches the personality, Dahmer's shadow gradually consumed more of his conscious life. His first killing at age 18 was impulsive and followed by 9 years without murder, suggesting an initial horror at what had emerged from his unconscious. But without therapeutic intervention or conscious integration, the shadow gained strength, eventually establishing its own ritualistic pattern of expression. Jung's understanding of the mother and father archetypes offers particular insight into Dahmer's psychology. His reportedly distant relationship with his mother and his complex relationship with his father potentially created what Jung would call archetypal deficits, inadequate embodiments of these primary patterns that form the foundation of the psyche. When these fundamental archetypes are poorly integrated, the resulting personality may struggle with basic issues of identity and belonging. The symbolic meaning of Dahmer's cannibalism deserves special attention. Beyond mere destruction, the act of consuming human flesh represents an attempted solution to his profound sense of emptiness. Jung might interpret this as a concrete literalization of the archetypal communion impulse, the desire to take something external into oneself to achieve transformation. What should have been a symbolic process of psychological incorporation instead became horrifically literal. Jung's concept of the complex, an emotionally charged group of ideas or images, helps explain the compulsive nature of Dahmer's behaviors. A complex functions as a partial personality with its own agenda, temporarily overwhelming the ego. Dahmer described his urges as nearly irresistible, suggesting they operated as autonomous complexes largely disconnected from his conscious control. His alcoholism likely weakened what little ego boundaries remained, allowing these complexes freer reign. The intense contradictions within Dahmer point to what Jung called the tension of opposites. Within the psyche, by day, he functioned at a chocolate factory. By night, he engaged in cannibalism, a dark parody of his daytime work preparing food. Jung believed that psychological growth comes from holding the tension between such opposites until a transcendent function emerges. In Dahmer's case, no such transcendence occurred, only oscillation between extremes. What Jung called inflation is evident in Dahmer's grandiose fantasies. As his crimes progressed, he imagined creating zombie sex slaves and building a shrine adorned with skulls. Jung described inflation as a state where the ego identifies with archetypal content, becoming godlike in its self-perception. Dahmer's godlike control over life and death, his attempts to create new forms of beings, all point to this dangerous inflation. The social dimension of Dahmer's pathology reveals what Jung called participation mystique, a term he borrowed from anthropologists Lucy and Levi-Broll to describe a primitive psychological state where clear boundaries between self and other don't exist. Dahmer's inability to recognize the full humanity and separateness of his victims suggests he experienced this boundary dissolution in a destructive form. Unable to distinguish where he ended and others began, most victims of Dahmer were men of color, often from marginalized communities. A Jungian analysis must acknowledge how his individual shadow connected with collective shadow material in society. Racism, homophobia, and the systematic devaluation of certain lives created conditions where Dahmer could operate undetected for years. Jung would recognize that individual pathology always exists within a collective context that may enable its expression. Dahmer's obsession with control manifesting in his attempts to create zombies who would never leave him speaks to Jung's understanding of how compensation works in the psyche. His extreme need for control likely compensated for a profound inner sense of chaos and helplessness. Jung observed that the psyche often attempts to balance itself through opposite expressions. The greater one's inner chaos, the more rigid the attempts at external control. The phenomenon of Jeffrey Dahmer forces us to confront what Jung called the reality of evil. Unlike some psychological theories that reduce evil to mere dysfunction, Jung acknowledged the existence of genuine malevolence as a potential within the human psyche. Yet Jung would resist simplistic demonization of Dahmer. Instead, he would likely see Dahmer's horrific acts as evidence of what happens when the self-regulating function of the psyche catastrophically fails. Jung's concept of the wounded healer takes on a perverse dimension in Dahmer's case. During his prison interviews, Dahmer demonstrated surprising insight into his own psychology, even suggesting that his brain be studied after death to help understand what went wrong. This reflects a distorted version of the wounded healer archetype. His wounds created not wisdom, but monstrosity, yet he maintained some awareness of his potential contribution to understanding human darkness. The religious elements in Dahmer's later life deserve Jungian analysis. After his arrest, Dahmer found religion in prison and was reportedly baptized. Jung would likely see this as an attempt to access the self-archetype, the organizing center of the psyche that often manifested in religious symbolism. Having failed to achieve wholeness through his perverse rituals of death, Dahmer turned to conventional religion as an alternative path toward the integration he never achieved in freedom. Dahmer's case illustrates Jung's understanding of the numinous, the overwhelming, fascinating, and terrifying aspects of unconscious archetypes. The numinous quality of archetypes explains why we remain collectively fascinated by figures like Dahmer, despite or perhaps because of their horrific actions. They embody shadow elements that exist within the collective unconscious, manifesting what most people experience only in nightmares or fleeting dark thoughts. What Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to create a third position that transcends seemingly irreconcilable opposites, never fully developed in Dahmer. Instead of integration, he remained trapped in oscillation between his seemingly normal persona and his monstrous shadow behaviors. Jung would likely view Dahmer's alcoholism as a failed attempt at self-medication, a chemical bridge between his divided selves that ultimately only deepened the split. From a Jungian perspective, Dahmer's intense focus on the internal organs and skeletons of his victims represents a distorted form of what Jung called the turn inward, the necessary psychological movement toward exploring one's own depths. Unable to properly introvert this psychic energy, Dahmer externalized it through literal dissection, seeking psychological meaning through physical penetration of others, rather than through self-reflection. The recurring dream Dahmer reported of slitting open the bodies of men he found attractive exemplifies what Jung called the compensatory function of dreams. Dreams often express what consciousness rejects. As Dahmer's conscious personality tried to maintain normalcy, his dreams revealed the split-off content growing in power. Jung would see Dahmer's eventual acting out of these dream images as evidence of what happens when dream content is neither integrated nor symbolically understood. Jung's concept of psychic infection helps explain how Dahmer's individual pathology connected to broader cultural patterns. Jung believed that unconscious content can spread between individuals or throughout a society. Like a contagion, the public's fascination with Dahmer, the creation of merchandise and entertainment based on his crimes, and the way his name became shorthand for monstrous behavior, all suggest a collective psychic infection, a shared participation in shadow material he embodied. The alchemical dimension of Jung's thought provides a framework for understanding Dahmer's obsession with transformation. Alchemy, which Jung saw as a projection of psychological processes onto matter, involved breaking down materials to create something new. Dahmer's dismemberment of bodies mirrors this alchemical dissolution solutio, but without the subsequent recombination into something higher, coagulatio. His was an alchemy arrested in the destructive phase, never reaching transformation or rebirth. Had Jung encountered Dahmer, he might have recognized what he called the archetype of meaning operating, even within such extreme pathology. Dahmer wasn't simply destructive, he was searching for something: connection, permanence, identity through horrifically misguided means. Jung believed that even the most disturbed behavior contains an inherent striving toward meaning that, if properly understood and redirected, holds the potential for healing. What does Dahmer reveal about our contemporary collective psyche? Jung would likely see him as a manifestation of particular forms of alienation, unique to modern society. In traditional cultures, clear initiation rites and community belonging provided channels for archetypal energies. In our fragmented society, individuals like Dahmer may become untethered from these structures, leaving archetypal forces to express themselves in distorted, destructive ways. Jung might view the public's continued fascination with Dahmer as evidence of our collective shadow hour, shared disowned potential for cruelty, objectification, and destruction. By projecting these qualities entirely onto figures like Dahmer, we avoid confronting similar tendencies within ourselves. The more exclusively we identify Dahmer as other, the more we risk disowning parts of the human experience that require conscious integration. Perhaps most profoundly, Jung would see in Dahmer's case evidence of what he called the spirit of the depths, operating even in the most disturbed human soul. Beneath Dahmer's horrific actions lay recognizably human longings for connection, understanding, and meaning. His methods were monstrous, but his motivations stem from the same archetypal wellspring that drives all human behavior. In Jung's framework, the ultimate aim of psychological development is wholeness, not perfection, but integration of all aspects of the self, light and dark. Dahmer represents the tragic consequence of failing to achieve this integration. His divided psyche became not just a personal tragedy, but a collective one, resulting in 17 lives lost and countless others forever changed. What, finally, would Jung say about Jeffrey Dahmer? Perhaps that he represents both a warning and a challenge, a warning about the destructive potential of the unintegrated shadow, and a challenge to recognize that even the darkest human behaviors emerge from the same psychic substrate we all share. In understanding Dahmer, We don't excuse or minimize his crimes, but we gain insight into the profound importance of conscious relationship with our own depths. As Jung wrote, the shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. Dahmer's story represents what happens when one neither successfully navigates this passage, nor turns back, instead remaining trapped in the constriction. Neither fully conscious nor unconscious, neither fully human nor inhuman, but suspended in a terrible liminality that ultimately consumed not just him, but all those who crossed his path.